Welcome to Gertrud Kauders, Jewish artist from Prague. Surprises, enigmas, opportunities in our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce Simon Doering, born in Wellington, New Zealand in 1950, who's Gertrude Kauders' great-nephew, who played a key role in retrieving her work. He's a professor of English literature who has worked in universities around the world, including the University of Melbourne, UC Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and the Freie Universität Berlin. He currently spends his time between Brisbane, Australia, and Berlin, Germany. His most recent book, co-written with Amanda Anderson, Humanities Theory, will appear soon with Oxford University Press. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Welcome, Simon Doering.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. In the last years of his life, my father, who in the 30s had fled to New Zealand from Germany, wrote a memoir. I didn't take it up immediately, but in 2019, after I and my partner had bought an apartment in Berlin and I'd applied for German citizenship, I fished it out and read it. I found it more compelling than I'd expected. My father's bleak, anachronistic worldview, half old European class consciousness, half New Zealand settler colonial civic mindedness, saturated it, returning me not just to my own childhood, but to disappeared worlds. The account of how my father escaped from Europe was especially arresting. It turned out that when he left Germany in 1935, aiming to become a Czech citizen and join the Czech army, he went to stay with his Jewish father's sister, Gertrude Kauders, in her Prague apartment. He devotes several pages to his time with her, and intrigued by them, I decided to Google her name. To my astonishment, a bunch of recent Czech tabloid news stories flashed up on the screen. They told a remarkable tale. The first story reported that when workmen were demolishing a house on Prague's outskirts, they were flabbergasted when about 30 works of art collapsed on them from a concealed ceiling. No one had had any idea the works were there. The paper, Nas Region, interviewed the house's current owner, Jacob Sedlacek, who identified the artist by Gertrude Kauders, a Jewish artist and exact Prague contemporary, the newspaper pointed out, of Franz Kafka. Some works were signed by Gertrude, but Mr. Sedlacek also remembered having heard of her as a friend of Natalie Yehudakova, herself an artist, who had built the house around 1941 and from whom his family had inherited it. It wasn't hard to figure out what must have happened. Gertrude and Natalie had hidden Gertrude's works from the Nazis in the face of Gertrude's imminent deportation. She was indeed rounded up in May 1942, sent at once by train to Theresienstadt, and then almost immediately to the Polish extermination camp Majdanek, where she was murdered on arrival. She died in May 1942. After Natalie Yehudakova's death in 1977, Gertrude's work, still hidden away, had, it seems, been completely forgotten. A second story about the find offered a bit more context. It interviewed Ivo Haben, an expert on early 20th century Czech art. His dissertation, which he'd written not long before, had mentioned Gertrude, although no one at that time had seen any of her work. Haben argued that she must have been a good artist because she'd exhibited in prestigious shows. He quoted the respected art critic Ottokar Schurer, who had reviewed one of these shows at the time, an exhibition organized by the German Czech Artists Association Concordia in 1926, who judged Gertrude's works to be, quote, perhaps the most successful thing in the exhibition because they are perfect, in their limits. In his thesis, Haben regretted that Gertrude Kauders' works were no longer able to be seen and probably never would be seen. But now, amazingly, unexpectedly, here some were. My immediate response to reading these articles was to reach out to Jakub Sedlacek. The news stories reported him as saying that he wished to donate the art to the Prague Jewish Museum, but that could only happen if legitimate heirs failed to turn up. I and my siblings, 5 of us in all, were those legitimate heirs. Gertrude had never married. She'd had no children. Her only brother, Hans, had only one son, my father, Peter During, so the works seemed to be ours. I wrote to the Prague Jewish Museum, who knew of the works but had not been given them and were not in contact with Jakub Sedlacek. It took about a year before we were able to make contact with him and to begin to arrange for Misha Seidenberg, the Prague Jewish Museum's chief curator, along with Amos Chappell, a Prague-based New Zealand journalist and photographer, to inspect and photograph Gertrude's works in situ. And the PowerPoint show you're seeing doesn't only consist of photos from that first session, but mainly is still those works, those photos. Then another surprise. It turned out there weren't 30-something works that had been hidden in Sedlacek's house, but almost 700. The contents of Gertrude's entire studio, dating back to her student years, had been preserved. There were oil paintings on canvas, some of which had once been stretched and framed. There were watercolours and gouaches. There were lithographs and drawings in ink. There were designs for family birthday cards and ex libris, together with hundreds of pencil or crayon sketches and drawings. Stored in darkness for almost 80 years, most were in surprisingly good condition. As Misha Seidenberg remarked, to find an entire studio completely preserved like this was all but unprecedented. Crucially, it was also a find of considerable aesthetic value. As Seidenberg also later told me, in her view, some of Gertrude's works, not least her drawings, were marked by a, quote, a stroke of genius. It took time for the trove to be handed over to the family. The siblings decided that we would choose a few works for ourselves, but the bulk of them would be donated to museums so a wider public could have the opportunity to see them. Today, the New York Jewish Museum, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., Te Papa, New Zealand's National Museum, and Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum all hold works by Gertrude Kauders. Over 300 works, almost all works on paper, have stayed with the Prague Jewish Museum. It was one thing to retrieve the works, it was quite another to come to terms with them, to understand not just what they meant to our family and its history, but more generally to the history of German-speaking Jewish art and culture. A couple of things were especially puzzling to me. Amazingly, I had not even known that Gertrude was an artist. I'll repeat that. I didn't know that Gertrude was an artist. As a young man, my father had lived with her in Prague between 1934 and 1938, exactly during the period that she was most active in the art world. But neither in his memoirs nor in informal conversations with his family did he so much as ever mention Gertrude's art or career as an artist. How could that be? Then too, exactly who was Gertrude? What did her work, her oeuvre, tell us about her as a person? And how to take in the work itself, how to appreciate and assess it, on what terms to treasure it. Gertrude was born in Prague to an affluent, secular, German-speaking Jewish family. Her father, Sigmund Kauders, was a successful lawyer. Her uncle on her mother's side, Gustav von Bender, an industrialist, was a major collector of Renaissance fine and decorative art, whose bequest to the Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum remains one of the largest the museum has ever received. At 21, Gertrude was given sufficient capital to live on for the rest of her life. Within 20 years, Most of that money, however, had evaporated in hyperinflation. She spent her last years poor. As a young woman, Gertrude studied in Paris, probably the Académie Julian, one of the Parisian art schools then open to female students, and which Kate Kollwitz, a family acquaintance, had also attended. She also studied in Munich with Max Feldbauer, a leading Munich secessionist. Later, after she returned to Prague, she also studied at the Ukrainian Academy and Art School, popular among international students and particularly women students. Traces of Gertrude's various teachers can be seen in her art, as well as of the post-impressionist paintings she must have come across in Paris when she was there, probably around 1910, but it may have been, we don't know exactly, may have been actually 1918 to 20. But she achieved her own unique vision. By 1924 at the latest, Gertrude was exhibiting in local Prague shows, including the Prague Secession. Despite us not so much as mentioning Gertrude's life as an artist, my father's memoirs give it the fullest account we have of her. Characteristically, it's a gloomy account. He presents Gertrude as an impoverished, lonely, aging, quote-unquote, meek woman. Until she was 30, he notes, she could not go to sleep unless her childhood nanny, and Anneli, was in the room asleep alongside her. She received few visitors. Tellingly, none were Jewish. One was a fellow artist, so poor now that she visited Gertrude, so my father supposed, mainly because she couldn't afford to turn on the heater at her own place. Another was Gertrude Spurk, a lively, generous person who during the First World War had been the famous Franz Werfel's girlfriend until Werfel deserted her for alma mater. In Spurk and Werfel's published letters, Gertrude is mentioned on quite different terms than those of my father's, as warm, generous, vital. Goethe's third visitor was Moko von Hanau, a German-Czech aristocrat, her father's friend, and grateful client, who also helped my father acquire Czech citizenship. My father hints at more. Gertrude was never interested in men, he says, suggesting that she was lesbian. On the evidence of her art, that's probably so. And she did not think of herself as Jewish, apparently having no relation at all to the Prague Jewish community. According to my father, she refused to leave Prague in time to escape the Nazis because, like so many secular Jews who thought of themselves primarily as German, she failed to appreciate the threat that Hitler posed. As late as 1939, in the interval between the Munich Agreement and when Chamberlain gave the Sudetenland up to Hitler, between then and the Nazis taking possession of Czechoslovakia by force, her brother, Hans, traveled to Prague from Ascona, Switzerland, where he was living, in order to persuade Gertrude to return with them while she could. Even in 1939, she refused. My father believed that Gertrude refused out of stupidity, but given what we now know, I wonder, could it be that she refused because of her art? That she refused to leave Prague because she didn't want to abandon her life's work, the contents of her studio, and hadn't yet found a way to preserve it. To me, that seems likely, even if the thought's corollary is chilling. If it's true, then Gertrude died for her art. For it, she stayed on in Prague until it was too late. The splendid trove we've inherited was paid for with her blood. Like many artists of the time, Gertrude worked across several genres: portraits, landscapes, still lives, urbanscapes, seascapes, industrial scenes, illustrations. Much of her work records everyday life. Most of the portraits are of family and friends, and often of her maid Annelie. She sketched the Luxembourg Gardens during her stay as a student in Paris. The landscapes mainly seem to be of the countryside where she holidayed. Many watercolors and some oils are images of what she sees out of a window, and particularly when she was young, she painted. She lived in an apartment right opposite the tower in Prague, and the view of the street in front of her, she draws watercolors mainly over and over again. Especially later in life, she often painted flowers, easy and cheap to assemble, usually in watercolor, but sometimes in oil too. Most of the experts who've looked at her work judge her drawings and watercolors more successful than her oils, and that seems to partly be because it was in those media that she could be most spontaneous, most sensitive to her surroundings. Many of her works are unfinished, or at least pass them off as unfinished, as if completion itself and the care completion requires insulted the spontaneity, insulted the moment. Gertrude's art displays a woman's world. There are very few portraits of men other than family members. One or two of the group scenes she drew involve lesbians, dykish-looking women intimately connecting to one another. This is not to say that hers was a joyful world of women. Many of her works, including works in pencil, show women alone, sometimes in cafes, usually sitting huddled, introspective, anxious. In her family, however, Gertrude was surrounded by men. There are affectionate portraits or sketches of her father and brother, as well as of her handsome relation, the conservative politician Fritz Lutsch's son, also Fritz. There are only a couple of images of her mother, pictured as a matriarch, stiff, unloving, at least mainly. In his memoir, my father mentions that she did not like her mother, and her work does seem to express that. Certainly her portraits of her mother have a very different emotional tone than we find in her strikingly affectionate portraits of her father. There's another side to Gertrude's oeuvre. Across her working life, she painted or drew many, many self-portraits. These are observant but also questioning works, as if she were asking herself, who am I? Or perhaps better put, what's the relationship between who I am and how I look? Some of these images have her striking a pose, the modern chic young woman, the beautifully dressed professional artist, the sensitive and artistic observer. Many also present her as practicing her art, easel beside her, brushes to hand, as if to insist on her vocation and overcome some insecurity. The oeuvre also records her aging. Several portraits meticulously examine what it's like to become old and to see yourself as old. Remarkably, one of these self-portraits is of her naked. Nude self-portraits by women artists are rare in art history. In this crayon drawing, drawn when she was already middle-aged, Gertrude presents herself both as a shape or as a sequence of shapes and as a vulnerable human being. What this drawing isn't is meek, or perhaps what it presents as meek passivity, pushed to the point at which it mutates into its opposites, into self-exposure, daring. Few of Gertrude's works are signed or dated. It's as if putting a name and date on them would be, once again, to congeal them, to breach their spontaneity. That makes it difficult to be sure exactly how her art skills and interests progressed across her career. But a certain narrative or temporal logic does seem to run through it. The first dated work we have comes from 1902 when she was 19. It's a rather dutiful close-up oil portrait of a boy in a German secessionist style. Her early art is generally more conventional, less marked by post-impressionism than her later work. But we have a suite of rather wonderful, bold and loose art school oil on canvas exercises in the nude, both male and female from that period, as well as several studies of the streets around where she lived, as I've said, near Prague's old city's Powder Tower, including a signed and dated 1918 piece in ink, along with several accomplished drawings of family members from the First World War period. After Paris, beginning in the 20s, early 20s, we begin to see echoes of Cézanne, Matisse, and Modigliani. After around 1923, her work loosens up to become more experimental still, so as to give her talent, her flair, freer rein. Her use of colour becomes more confident, her palette more various, her touch more fluid. Some works venture into the avant-garde. She often structures them more assistantly around rhythms between lines and curves, especially in the pictures of branches and trees she loved to draw. At the same time, while she remains concentrated on ordinary surroundings and her ordinary life world, she also paints unflinching realist portraits in oil of women she knew, some of her servant, Annalie. These, I think, are among her finest works. It's only in the 1930s that I can see clear signs that her work may have been intended for a buying public. Presumably by that time, her financial position had become precarious. By then, she was also giving drawing lessons and providing or trying to provide illustrations for magazines and books. Most striking among these more commodified works are bold, modernist portraits of women in oil that seem to have been prepared for the prestigious exhibitions that she did indeed exhibit at. Some involve not very festive women in festive or gay settings. Some involve mothers and children. A few are highly stylized works in one or other of the then fashionable aesthetic modes. As far as we know, none were ever actually sold. Perhaps because the prices Gertrude charged for them were high, we have records of one of the exhibitions her works were the most expensive in the whole exhibition. Perhaps because their aura is somewhat unsettling. As yet, there are no records of her having sold any artwork at all, which I'll say as a side, makes it impossible to get insurance or for them because they have no value and no art value will put a dollar figure on them. But the fact that Gertrude did not mainly paint to sell her work means that her art, intended for no one in particular, could be truer and closer to herself. So that although she was a highly trained painter and also was professionally engaged, primarily my sense is she painted for herself. The question remains, why did the family have no idea that Gertrude was a dedicated artist, one who may well have valued her work so highly that she paid for its preservation with her life? That's a question which spills over into a more general one. What value do we now attach to the world she came from, the world her work helps make visible, the bourgeois, bohemian in both senses of the word, German secular Jewish world that flourished across the 50 years of Gertrude's own lifespan? The main reason why we had no idea that Gertrude was an artist is simple. Connections between her and us had to pass through my father. And my father was, in this context, a dead end. In 1940, on the passage out from England to New Zealand, he changed his name from Cornelius Kauders to Peter During. He used to say that when asked his name by a fellow passenger, he suddenly realized he couldn't come out with Cornelius Kauders with its foreign Jewish connotations, and to his own surprise, spontaneously said Peter During instead. His Aryan mother had been a During. My father had spent his boyhood at Salem, a Bavarian boarding school founded by Prince Max of Hanover and Kurt Hahn of Outward Bound and Gordonston fame. Established in 1920, Salem was designed to replenish Germany's elite cadre after its destruction in the First World War. Hahn, although Jewish, was very conservative for quite a while, a fan of Mussolini's, for instance, and my father absorbed his values. It's no exaggeration to say that Salem formed my father right through. He was a boarder there in the prep school from the age, I think, of about 4 or 5 until 18, 19, when the Nazis kicked him out. Even though in exile in New Zealand, he became intent on becoming just an ordinary Kiwi bloke and dedicated his life as a public servant to developing the settler colonial nation's state. He became a recognised expert on soils and fertilisers, an important role given New Zealand's agricultural economy. Nonetheless, his worldview remained that of his school, remained that of Kurt Hahn. He rejected his father's and his aunt Gertrude's world. His parents had lived near Ascona, which was at that time a capital of European Bohemia. After the money ran out, his father, an intellectual, worked as a translator and travel writer. His aunt, of course, was living her life as a lesbian modern artist in Prague. My father despised all that, not just because he'd absorbed Hahn's Plato-based emphasis on public service, noblesse oblige, self-reliance, physical toughness, and leadership, but because his aunt and parents assimilated Jewish world, committed to art, literature, music, and ideas, failed miserably to see what was coming. I failed miserably to see Hitler. As far as my father was concerned, the arty intellectuals with whom his parents and aunt associated were neither tough enough nor sufficiently attuned to ordinary society to offer Hitler resistance when he did come to power. At the same time, my father was contemptuous of religious Jews, especially those who emigrated to German-speaking regions from further east, to Ostjuden, accusing them of failing to embrace the modern world, as well as, of course, the ancient Greek ethos into which he'd been trained at school. All this meant that when he arrived in New Zealand to start out all over again, this time from nothing, it was easiest for him both to forget the world in which his aunt and parents had lived. The result, on one side, no possibility that he would identify with his Jewishness, on another, no telling his family that Gertrude had been a serious artist. As I see it, his refusal of his own Jewishness, along with the casual anti-Semitism which I, as a child, experienced, and he was anti-Semitic, my father, he was Jewish anti-Semite. It's probably maybe not an anecdote I should say, but I'll never forget when I brought home a close Jewish friend of mine. My father intensely whispered after he left, "Why do you hang out with these ghetto Jews?" Which was not something that you would ever heard anyone else say in New Zealand at that period. The casual anti-Semitism which I, as a child, experienced in him intensifies the big question which Uncovering Gertrude's Studio leaves us with: how to relate not just to Gertrude and her work, but to the world she came from, that world of secular, advanced, cultivated, more or less Bohemian, German-speaking Jews. That world, we know, has now disappeared. It was another Holocaust victim. But disconcertingly, it has not been fully affirmed post-mortem, because after 1945, Western Jewishness changed. Jews, as we know, came under pressure to take pride in their identity as Jews, that identity being focused on the project of building Israel, as well as, often enough, the Jewish religious heritage too. Jewish assimilation was discouraged. In fact, it was sort of blackballed. You were not allowed really to be an assimilated Jew. People began to dismiss assimilated Jews as betraying their culture, sometimes as self-hating even. And Gertrude's way of being a Jew, that is, of not being a Jew while still being unavoidably Jewish, was cast aside, cast into history. Gertrude's oeuvre helps us see what a mistake this move has been, this forgetting, this destruction of that kind of way of being a Jew, what we have lost by it. As I've begun to suggest, Gertrude's art records us the subjectivity of a Jewish person, as it were, without an integral identity. She was neither Jewish nor not Jewish, neither German nor not German, and thus I'd suggest both meek and bold, and as an artist, especially sensitive to the flows and situations she found herself in. Of course, assimilated German Jews produced many of the most important intellectual literary works of the time, still vital texts by writers like Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Kafka, Warburg, Wittgenstein, many, many, many others, Mannheim, Adorno, etc., etc. All these people were simultaneously Jews and not Jews. Gertrude, the timid lesbian with a touch of artistic genius, offers another entry into their dislocated world, as well as another reason to value and remember it. And that's all of my talk. It's a bit short. I'm sorry about that, but maybe, hopefully, there'll be some questions. Are we there?
Okay, I'm back here. And thank you so much for that really fascinating talk, Simon. I'm wondering, with that complicated family history that you spoke about, how did you react as a family to learn about the all the artworks that were found? Like how did you deal individually and as a family with that?
Well, it's an interesting question. My siblings sort of live all over the world, or they say I live in Australia, Germany. My other brother was living in the States and out in the, up in Darien, Connecticut. And my two sisters in New Zealand. So we're all spread around the world, and we hadn't seen a lot of each other. So the first thing to say is that this discovery brought us together. We decided, without really any dissension amongst us, that we would give most of the works to museums, as I said in the talk. So what we decided to do is that we would each take two works and then let those museums that we were interested in working with and that were interested in working with us to choose as many as they want. And then we'd take a few more if we wanted. And then Prague Jewish Museum said they would take all the works on paper. They were not so interested in the canvases because the costs of conservation and of restoration. The canvases were in worse nick than the works on paper. And that's sort of what we did. In terms of appreciating the art, I think it took us all, and it certainly took me, some time to take it in. I now think that, Gertrude is a really, seriously good artist. She's not a great artist. She doesn't invent new styles. She's not a leading modernist artist or anything, but she has a touch. She has a lightness. She has a spontaneity, as I said. She has a color sense that are really. She has a way of organizing the image that are really very, very unusually good. I first thought of her work really as recording her life, and so I thought they were sort of historically interesting. And it was, in fact, Misha Seidenberg of the Prague Jewish Museum who first said to me, don't just do that. Don't think of her work as historical. Think of it aesthetically. Think of it as a significant aesthetic resource.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I am now. It's taken me a long time, and I'm still learning more about her work. I'm still fascinating. These images you're seeing, like that one, you see the discoloring, that one has been restored. These are the very first photographs taken in Jacob Sedlacek's attic of these works, and you can see can't remember the technical name for that, but you can see in her hair there, the white sort of bloom there, which comes off almost immediately when the restorer looks at it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, did
This
you?
is her. That's a self-portrait. These flowers, I think, are slightly symbolic. She's got them of her. She's got various portraits of her. That's obviously not been restored, and it would look rather different once it's been restored. I don't know who owns that one, and I don't know if it's been restored. But there's many of these of her, and sometimes of other people, with holding these slightly symbolic, generally of sort of transitoriness, things that are going to die, like flowers, or things that sparkle but haven't got much substance.
Yeah. So how can we envision that? Like you read these newspaper clippings, and then did you get together with your siblings? Like, did you meet, or did you whatever?
No, because we
Zoom
weren't
or
in the same.
I know.
We weren't in the same place. We were online. I mean, it was a long, slow process. I couldn't get in touch with Jacob Sedlacek. He didn't, nor could the Prague Jewish Museum. In fact, the story is a little bit more complicated than I said there. The workmen that found the work were a socialist sort of communist cooperative that had also operated at the time in America called Acorn. I don't know, there was a media scare about them, I think in sort of 2018 or something, or maybe a bit earlier, to Acorn. And Jacob had hired them to demolish this house that he'd inherited. And they were the ones who the works poured down on. They were the ones who went to the media and said, this is what's happened. It seems as though they and Jacob were thinking of maybe keeping the works and trying to exhibit them, and probably trying to make some money out of
Mhm.
them.
Right.
And I don't know that. And I don't want to say anything. And, there wasn't. If that's so, that's up to them. That was their issue. But it wasn't easy to get hold of them, and I couldn't personally. I was the one who found them. I was the one who made all the first moves. But it was actually my sisters who came up with a way of getting to Jacob through a New Zealand friend of theirs who lived in Prague, who was married to a Prague woman, and they managed to winkle Jacob out, and it was very slow. We paid money for them. They were not just handed over. We paid for them. And so we all worked together, my sisters and I. This is one of the slightly sort of avant-garde Modigliani-ish ones that it's hard to know why she painted. That's a wonderful one, I think, but it's not typical. There are these ones that are like this, and some are not, and different styles and that, some slightly,
Yeah.
different avant-garde styles she's doing.
And you can see how she took the canvases of the stretchers, and you see
Yes, they
the,
were on stretchers, and some of them were probably actually framed, I think.
yeah,
I,
yeah.
yeah, as well as just on stretchers. But yeah,
It must have taken her forever to take
it
them
must
off
have
the
taken. I
stretcher.
think she and her friend would have done it. Yes, I mean
Yeah.
it must. I mean and you know, the amount of time and effort they did to doing it, putting them up, putting them in the house, etc. I think that was the, you know, that was what was important to her. It was important. That's another self-portrait of her in the 20s, looking sort of modern and chic, slightly anxious, sort of typical look, really.
Yeah.
Questioning. It's a great work, that one.
It's amazing that the paperwork survived, that it didn't get
Yes.
moldy or didn't get, didn't get draw humidity or I mean, it looks like they were
No.
perfectly, not perfectly, but very well conserved.
They were done. The quality of the paper was very high. Well, the ones that have been restored, the restorers have said this. You know, it's unusually. She spent money on the paper, so that's helped.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I think that the watercolor ink, the paint, and all the paint she used was high quality.
yeah.
That's one that's here in the house that I'm in now, the apartment, the Berlin apartment where I'm now. There's several like this. It's a girl reading. There's quite a few of her works of women reading.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's quite tender and intimate.
This is beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Very simple, you know,
Mhm.
it's complicated, but it works, you know, and it's got that slightly unfinished finish. This is finished, obviously, but it's got a slightly, you know, there's a lot of unpainted space on that
Right.
piece. And that's my father as a young boy.
Okay.
That's a portrait of his nephew, the one who didn't tell us that she was an artist. I mean, there's several he sat for a lot of times. There's at least two or three very worked through oil portraits of him. There's lots of pencil sketches of him. There's this work, you know. So he sat down for her. That's a beautiful work on flowers. That's also here. It's one of mine.
Uh-huh.
The other thing to be said is that two of my siblings died between the time we found the work and now. So that's been a bit of a tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's beautiful, isn't
It's
it? That one?
gorgeous. It's gorgeous. And you can see, like, with seeing the first photographs and then seeing the framed version, of course, you see how much, care each and every artwork needs to be, ready to, I guess, to be ready to be exhibited and to be
Yeah.
seen by, a larger public. So that's
Yeah.
a whole
I mean,
other.
we've had issues with the framing. We are, that's a slightly androgynous one. It's one of, I wouldn't say that, is that a girl or a boy? What do you think? I've always thought it was a girl, but my wife thinks it's a boy. That's also, I own that one. It's here too.
Mhm. Well, the truth is, could be both.
It could be either, but there's like this, there is quite a lot of this slightly lesbianish feel to quite a few of the portraits have this sort of lesbianish feel.
But the thing is, in the 20s, 30s, first of all, the modern woman had short hair and had this boyish,
Yes.
was also dressing in a very male way, being, happy to be liberated from that, defined female dress code. Um, and also in artist circles, in cultural circles, I mean, many artists were practicing very free sexuality, much
Yes.
freer actually than it would be today. So
And
there's that.
especially in places like Ascona, I think, where her brother was living. It was famous for that.
Mhm. Yeah. So
Don't know if she herself was like that. I sort of think she probably wasn't. But I mean, the sort of Erica Mann thing, you know, she's the sort of embodiment of it all.
mhm. Yeah, but the fashion in terms of the female look being a little
Yeah,
more
boyish. Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
open or being more a choice, let's put it like that, being more a free choice
yeah,
and even being free to, depict as a woman to pick a female nude is new for that time, really,
yeah.
right?
Exactly, exactly. This we think is her maid. That's her maid.
Mhm.
And
So
there's
she got
quite a few.
everyone to sit for her.
You got everyone to sit for her. There's quite a few portraits of them. I don't. This again, I don't know. That's. Don't know where that shot came from. I don't know if that's the original one that Prague. It's also signed up the top there. So
Yeah,
not many signed. It's hard to know why they were. It's very hard to say why some are signed and some are not. I mean, most of them are not, but a few are. But why? It's not necessarily the more finished or more ambitious ones that are signed.
right. So I mean, the this is
There's
very.
another self-portrait,
Mhm.
slightly. This is one of these oils that most people think, as I said, that the watercolors and gouaches are more successful. But I myself have grown to appreciate a work like this. It's not easy. It's not easy to look at, I think, in a way that some of her works are.
Mhm.
But it's it's a very interesting self-portrait and very subtle. The coloring is subtle.
Yeah.
This again has not been that signed and dated. That's 37, I think. So it's late. And
Mhm.
that's probably one that she was hoping to sell. The ones in the late 30s, we think, were probably painted to sell.
Mhm.
But it's not been restored there. It has been restored now,
Mhm.
but it's another one I like. Again, the slightly anxious, slightly sad,
Mhm.
melancholy things she does, slightly interiorized.
Mhm. And actually, in the bottom of the canvas, it's almost abstract
Yes.
in its
Yeah.
appearance. So,
There's
uh,
quite a lot of that. And that I think was common. That was a lot of work of this period has that,
mhm,
those way of sort of organizing color and space.
right. So,
That looks as though it's unfinished, but I'm not sure that it is. That has been restored, and I like it a lot.
yeah,
One of these, it's probably of a family member, I think, but I don't know whom. And again, it's got that slightly abstracty thing at the top, and
yeah,
it's finished. It's a finished work. It's not unfinished.
yeah, yeah. I mean, if I look at you, I can see some family resemblance.
Yeah, no,
But
it's not it's not my grandfather, and it's certainly not my father, but it does have. There's also my father always used to talk about his handsome cousin, and
mhm,
there's many drawings of him, Fritz Weschel, and he wasn't he was half Jewish. His father wasn't Jewish, and his
mhm,
father was a very conservative, almost Nazi type politician married to a Jewish woman, which was not completely uncommon at the time.
yeah. And actually, if the mother was Jewish, he was Jewish too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Now that's one of those more realist
yeah,
portraits that I was telling about that are, well, I think are amongst her finest works. I think that one is one of her finest works.
yeah. So the curator in me is asking, like, how I think it's very you had quite some foresight and very smart to have given the work into public collections and um, ensuring that they will be well kept and that people are also working on it. But Are there people working on it? Like, are there documents that are being worked at? Is anybody working on an exhibition? Because of course now we want to see the works like originals, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
There are various things happening. A woman I don't know, in fact, an American woman, I think from New York, is writing a novel and has, I think, got some funding to do so. And she's a novelist of some who's of some note. I mean, I don't know, I can't remember her name. I don't know her novels, but she's got a track record, and she's writing a novel. There's a film being made about it in New Zealand.
mm,
Um, I don't know if people have heard of the Hall Art Foundation, a foundation which has 3 museum spaces, one in Germany and 2 in the States. They have committed to doing a show of hers, though it's very, very early days in that. And the New Zealand National Portrait Gallery is doing one, I think in maybe early 2026.
mhm,
So there are, and the New York Jewish Museum has said that they are going to put some of her works, they have about 40 of her works, are going to put some on permanent display. They're remodeling their upstairs, their first floor, I believe, and they are going to put. They haven't chosen the works yet, but they will put some on permanent display. They're very happy to have them and proud of
mhm.
them. See them.
Yeah, thank you. So few of the participants are asking
Yeah, I can't see them, but if you could read them out.
where they can watch, whether there's a possibility to watch this talk. So yes, we are recording, and yes, everyone who registered will get a link to the recording, and the recording will also live on YouTube and on our website. So you will receive that information. And so that's one thing. Barbara is asking, is there a website or a database where we can access some of these splendid images and use them for teaching purposes?
There isn't. I mean, the no, that's a good idea. So, someone recently said we should do this, and maybe we'll try and organize it. The Prague Jewish Museum are committed to putting all their works up in on the web, and they have sort of done quite a lot of work to prepare for that, and that will happen. And I think they have 350 or something works there.
Mhm,
The DC Holocaust Museum, which doesn't have so many works, but has put their one up, they're already up, and the ones in New Zealand, Te Papa, are also up. So you can see those works. I don't know, the New York Jewish Museum, I think, is not as focused on web presentation as some of the other museums. So those ones are not up. And it's a pity because they have about 40 works, as I said, and they also chose them really for aesthetic reasons, where some of the other museums didn't choose them. Like the Papa Museum chose them really for Jewish exile ref, refugees from Nazi
mhm,
purposes, not so much as fine art.
mhm. Yeah.
And
Um,
the Holocaust Museum a bit the same in DC. It's a slightly different interest, which is understandable.
of course, of course. And I will actually send in the follow-up email, I will send also, Simon, if you share this with me, I will send the links to the works which are up already. And
Okay.
I think, I think it's very, very important to realize how long it takes, how long things take, to
Yeah.
have a group of 700 artworks is already quite a large group to just simply photograph them. And, you had your legal and your family process before that until you had the works, and then it took a long time until the institutions had the works, and so one has to really realize that this does take a long time, and in order to prepare, there was a question whether there's a catalog to look at. I'm sure the catalog will come with the exhibition, but that again, takes some time. First, your father's memoir has to. I believe you studied it, but I think others have to see it as well. At least scholars who want to, publish something about Gertrude and your family. So your family is leading a public life now.
Actually, I guess we haven't. Yeah, and as you say, it does. And obviously, the works have had to be restored. That's not cheap.
Of course.
And get framed, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's all really only happened fairly recently. We only got the works, I don't know, less than 2 years ago, a year or so ago,
Wow. Yeah.
So it's a process. It's a process.
Yeah. Yeah. So Lorraine is asking, did anyone else in your family have her artistic talent?
No. I hope I'm not insulting anyone. No. The answer to that is no. No.
Maybe it skips a generation. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I think that these well brought up, rich young Jewish women in Prague were under a lot of pressure and were very well trained and very well taught. She was very well taught. She went to Munich. She went to the best places, Paris, Munich.
Right.
So she had a training.
Yeah.
My brother Mike has said his works are still being restored. So he's got Michael's got a lot of oils, and his works will go into the show that's going to be in the Portrait Gallery in Wellington, New Zealand.
Yeah. Yeah. And Claire O'Leary is saying, thank you so much.
She's making a film.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simon. One thing Miriam, your sister, found so amazing was recognizing your great aunt as a lesbian artist like herself, and the reclaiming of your family name too, Miriam Kauders. Could you talk about that?
Well, my sister Miriam, who unfortunately tragically died less than 6 months ago, she and I were the ones who had most to do with the retrieval of it. She was absolutely she as absolutely involved in a personal kind of way with Gertrude in her art in a way that I often am not. She thought my father had made terrible mistakes by changing his name, by avoiding his Jewishness, and of course, in worse than that, this sort of anti-Semitism. She became very interested in the Jewish faith. She became a committed member of in Auckland, the Jewish feminist women's group that was very long-lasting, very close to each other, who played a great role at her funeral. So she changed her name back from Mary Jessica Emily During, a sort of upper middle class name if there ever was one, back to Miriam Kauders, which of course pissed my father off. She probably did it for that reason. She has invested a lot. She invested a lot of emotion and a lot of sympathy and passion for Gertrude, and played a major role in getting the artworks back. So, but she's the one who had that Jewish. She identified with Gertrude as a Jew and as a lesbian. We're not completely sure that Gertrude was a lesbian, and I think she was.
Yeah. And I don't think we need to, nail her down on that.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So
That's
Bob,
right. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. So Barbara is saying, thank you for your fascinating talk. I wonder how much gender, lesbianism, and misogyny complicated Gertrude's sense of self and of being an outsider. Do you think her timidity was less a crisis of faith in herself and her talent, and more that she knew her family and society would never accept her as a lesbian? She depicts her world with objectivity because she didn't really feel part of it.
All good points. I don't know the answer to those questions. Nobody
Right.
does. But they're very suggestive, very powerful. It's a very powerful way of viewing her. Whether that was how she herself felt her world, I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think in the end it's probably, the further study of the artwork as a whole will probably give some more
Yes, and I think
enable
that's
some more
yeah, yeah,
discussion
yeah.
points. As I said, I don't think we
Yeah.
have to nail
I
her.
think one of the fascinating things about this is that we are discovering not only the works but also her.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, it's who was this person who
Right,
painted these
right,
works
right,
is the key question.
right, right. And of course, like um, as you're discovering or discussing that with your family, you're also asking who is your family in a way, right?
Yes,
It's like a
yes,
lot of
yeah,
um, reflection on, even though you're not a direct descendant, but it's allows for a lot of reflection on
yes.
where your family came from and the
And
roots
my
of it.
father was a damaged person. My father, like so many people who was a, probably not technically a Holocaust survivor, but really was a Holocaust survivor, um, was damaged by it and
Yeah,
never regained his equilibrium.
yeah,
And so he's the medium. And one of the great things about this is seeing what an amazing woman she was. We don't know exactly who she was or what she was in herself.
right,
We do know she was an amazing person, an amazing creativity.
yeah,
And Misha Seidenberg, who's thought about these issues, says to me quite often, I think she had a very, very deep interior life, which she didn't express, only her art expressed it.
yeah,
So that's
yeah,
another possible.
yeah, yeah. I definitely can see that. I can see that also, and um, yeah, and I think by these through these articles, through our event now, through the exhibitions that are coming, through the online collections. Claire was not put actually the Te Papa's online collection, the link
Thank you.
in
Thank you,
the
Claire.
chat. So that's a great resource, and I think the more people look at it, maybe we find also more letters, more of the environment really, and the network of people who she lived in. So I think this is, as you said, it's like the beginning of the process of discovering her as you discover the paintings and or the artwork. How many of the 700 works, asked Lorraine, still don't have a home?
Well, they all have a home, and the ones that the museums didn't take that were then distributed amongst the family.
Mhm.
So they're all none of them are on the street. None of them are homeless. They're all homeless. Some of them I mean, my hope is that some more will go to public institutions
Uh-huh.
and uh, not necessarily immediately, but I
Right.
mean, one of my slight fears has been that as the siblings live apart and that goes to their children and their grandchildren, we will lose sight of where they are, and
Mhm.
they'll never be able to be retrieved. And I would love that not to happen. I would love them all to have a public presence of some sort or other, even if they're
Right.
privately owned. They're
Yeah.
all catalogued and located. We know where they are, and I would like to see more of them put somewhere. I don't know. Various ideas have come up about where we might put another, say,
Yeah.
60, 70.
Yeah. So there you have your next project, like a website that combines
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
all
That's right.
works and
That's right.
with references to
I don't know
where
if I'm the best person to do that.
yeah. Thank you so much, Simon, for
Okay. Thank
talking
you. Thank you.
with
Thank you.
us. And oh, Caroline is asking where any letters, documents found.
There are a couple of letters. There's some letters from her. She was very close to her brother Hans, my grandfather. There's some letters of her to him that have been found. There are a few documents. I mean, there are some art world documents. There's some records of she shows, but there's not a lot. No, there may be more.
Right.
There may be more. That is, there may be more. So we may well find more out.
Yeah, I hope so. And actually, Mike is writing that he intends to have his in public collections because he doesn't have children. So that's good.
Yeah, yeah,
So thank you so much, Simon. And I hope that you will keep in contact with us and let us know if
yeah.
there's an
Well,
exhibition
yeah,
that we
well,
can,
yeah.
spread the word about. And so that's very, very exciting. And good luck with your work. And good luck
Yeah.
with we're tremendously thankful that you recovered altogether Gertrude's work and that it's out in the open now. And I can't wait for the next steps and for, getting to know her more and her work. Thank you.
Well, can I just say thank you to the Fritz Asher Society for the opportunity to make her work better known. And it's, very important. It seems to be a nice fit between you and this. It's a sort of perfect fit, really.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks a lot and
Okay.
all the best. All the best
Thanks.
to everyone. Thank
Yeah.
you.